Mr. President, I rise today to speak about Oswaldo Paya and, as I've done before, to urge this body to honor his legacy. Paya was a Cuban dissident who fought against the communist regime and who stood up and fought for free speech, for democracy, and for human rights. He was a thorn in the side of the Cuban communist regime his entire life. Oswaldo Paya was the only person at his school who refused to join the communist youth. Later, at the age of 35, he founded the Christian Liberation Movement, which called for nonviolent disobedience against the rule of the Cuban Communist Party. He then founded the Varela Project, which sought a referendum on Cuba's communist system. Throughout, he fought for democratic governance, religious liberty, freedom of expression, and the freedom to start businesses. For over 3 decades, Paya put pressure on the communist regime to free its political prisoners, to allow for genuine elections, and to uphold basic human rights. In retaliation, the regime harassed him. They arrested him repeatedly. And ultimately, in 2012, they killed him. But in life and in death, they never succeeded in silencing his message. Growing up, I heard countless stories from my father about life in Cuba. And they instilled in me from a very young age the desire to fight for change, to fight for truth, to fight for freedom. The yearning for liberty and the courage to fight for it is universal and deeply felt in every Cuban heart. Mr. President, since 2015, in every Congress, I have introduced legislation to rename the street outside the Cuban embassy Oswaldo Paya Way. This body has passed it before, rightly, unanimously. Oswaldo's legacy matters deeply to Cuba and to the United States. And it matters to his family, with whom I have worked closely on this resolution. Over the years, I've met many times with his daughter, Rosa Maria Paya. And Rosa Maria is herself a formidable and courageous dissident and warrior for human rights. Renaming the street in front of the Cuban embassy would help preserve that legacy. During the Cold War, President Reagan renamed the street in front of the Soviet embassy Sakharov Plaza, after the famed human rights dissident in the Soviet Union. It was part of a broader strategy to shine a light on the abuses of the evil empire. My strategy here is the same. Some might think a street name is not that big a deal. Well, it is. Anyone who wants to write to the Cuban embassy will have to write Oswaldo Paya's name. Anyone who wants to go there has to look up the address and see his name. The operatives of the Cuban regime will have to say or write his name. Saying his name has power. In just a moment, I will propound a unanimous consent request to take up and pass the Oswaldo Paya Way resolution. And I want to point out this is bipartisan legislation. Indeed, I am joined by Senator Dermod, the Democrat whip, in this legislation. In a previous Senate, this passed the Senate 100-0. That means every Republican voted for it and every Democrat voted for it. I am hopeful this Congress can demonstrate the same unity and the same resolve to stand up in support of democracy and in support of human rights. Right now, We will find out if that's the case. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs be discharged from further consideration of S-218 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from New Jersey.
reserving the right to object. I stand in agreement with my colleague. Mr. Oswaldo Paya is an extraordinary hero, not just to the Cuban people, but to millions of Americans, including millions of New Jerseyans, and especially to the Cuban American community in my state. He is a freedom fighter who stands for our most treasured and sacrosanct ideals. I want to work with my colleague to find a way to honor him. I'd be willing to partner with him in doing something to elevate this cause and this principle and the noble ideals that my colleague speaks to. The challenge right now is that we are in different times. This bill would permit Congress to rename a DC-owned intersection. But the District of Columbia has the right to self-governance. When I was mayor of the city of Newark, if my state came in against my objections to rename streets on my city, I would have objected. The people of the District of Columbia have the right to control their own local affairs. Their rights are enshrined in Home Rule. It is critical that we reject attempts that infringe upon those rights. The locally elected DC Council alone has the right to rename DC streets, and there is no dispute that the intersection in question is DC-owned. Since the beginning of Home Rule, the Council has opposed congressional efforts to rename its streets. Recently, Representative Holmes Norton strongly has made her views known, that she opposes this bill on those grounds. Washington, D.C. has no representation in this body. We must respect the wishes of the locally and democratically elected council and D.C.'s representatives in Congress. Indeed, these democratic ideals are what we are talking about right now. This objection is not about recognizing the courageous work of Oswaldo Paya. I will tell you, I have a deep reverence and respect, and I offer again, I will do anything I can to support the elevation of this hero, of this democratic light. Mr. Paya bravely fought for freedom and democracy in Cuba. He was killed due to his heroic work. I hope perhaps our Congress can appropriate resources to do something to honor this noble man and his ideals. I hope we can think constructively about what else we can do. His work should be recognized more by our nation. And I would support the DC Council, their elected representatives, if it decided through their democratic process to work with the senator and the Democratic sponsor to rename the street. My objection is simply right now about Washington, D.C.'s right to control their own local affairs. This objection is about home rule and self-governance. Now, it is true, as my colleague said, that this has passed through this chamber multiple times. But you would understand if D.C. is pushing for us not to do it this time because the current administration in the White House has stepped up their efforts to undermine home rule, is looking to D.C. as a testing ground for extreme policies. The fact that D.C. has been deprived of statehood makes the people of the district feel even more vulnerable under this president to the policies of the administration. They are asserting in an even stronger way with me and others who feel a fidelity to the home rule ideals that we should take a stand now. We cannot make D.C. and its residents more vulnerable still by further eroding and encroaching upon the District of Columbia's right to self-governance. That is a sacrosanct ideal that our country has stood for. No taxation without representation. The ability to elect your governing officials and entrust upon them to make decisions for your community. It is under these principles and ideals, Mr. President, that I object, and it is with a sincere heart that I offer my colleague the willingness to work with him on other ways we might be able to bestow an honor on this extraordinary hero.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
I must say the objection from my friend from New Jersey is deeply unfortunate. The remarks that he gave were unfortunately seriously in error. The senator from New Jersey suggested that it is only the D.C. City Council that has the power to do this. That is objectively false. D.C. is a city unlike any city in America because D.C., the Constitution explicitly gives the authority to govern D.C. to the Congress of the United States. That is written into the Constitution. My friend from New Jersey said he would object if this were done in Newark, New Jersey. Well, Newark, New Jersey is not in the Federal District of Columbia, which the Constitution gives to Congress to govern. It's also objectively disproven by the example I gave. We have done this before. When Ronald Reagan was president, he signed into law legislation renaming the street in front of the Soviet Union Sakharov Plaza. The author of that legislation is someone, Mr. President, you and I still serve with. He is the senior-most serving member of this body, Senator Chuck Grassley, then a brand new senator, introduced the legislation to rename the street in front of the Soviet embassy, and it was part of shining a light on communist oppression. Now, the legislation that the senator from New Jersey just objected to is Cruz-Durbin. Its lead Democrat author is Senator Dick Durbin, the whip for the Democrat Party. This is not partisan legislation. And indeed, this exact legislation, Senator Booker, who just objected, voted for it. Just 2 years ago in this Congress, it passed 100-0, and one of those 100 was my friend Senator Booker. He voted yes. By the way, one of the most vocal advocates of this legislation was Senator Booker's former colleague, Senator Bob Menendez, another Cuban American. And there is a rich irony because after Florida, the state of New Jersey has a massive Cuban American population. To see a senator from New Jersey objecting, I know this is not his intent, but the communist government of Cuba is cheering right now because they do not want to acknowledge Oswaldo Paya. They murdered him, and they don't want to have to say his name. They don't want anyone to say his name. And I know there are Cuban American residents of New Jersey whose hearts are heavy right now. They are hurting to see their elected senator object over not just honoring Oswaldo Paya, but calling out the regime. Senator Booker suggests, some other general statement, Paya's a nice guy, we should do that. That's not the purpose here. I'm happy to support any resolution praising Oswaldo Paya. I've done so many times. The purpose here is to put pressure on the Cuban communist regime. And naming the street does that. Now, Mr. President, as I pointed out, Senator Booker voted for this identical legislation just 2 years ago. This bipartisan legislation. That leads to the obvious question, what has changed? And one thing has changed. The residents of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. When Senator Booker voted for this bipartisan legislation, Joe Biden was the president. Today, Donald J. Trump is the president. And unfortunately, our Democrat colleagues have decided bipartisan cooperation is no longer something they're interested in. Their party is instead unified behind one principle, which is that they hate Donald J. Trump. We're in day 15 of a government shutdown because the Democrats are unwilling to fund the federal government, unwilling to pass a clean continuing resolution, which, by the way, every one of them, including the senator from New Jersey, have given speeches about how it is reckless and irresponsible to shut the government down, not to pass a clean continuing resolution. And yet, just earlier today, almost every single Democrat voted for the 9th time in the last 2 weeks to shut the government down, whereas Republicans unified to reopen it. This weekend, there will be a rally in D.C. of left-wing radicals, the so-called No Kings rally. Many, if not most of us, on the Republican side of the chamber believe the reason the government is still shut down is because Democrat senators are terrified for that rally to occur and those left-wing radicals to see that the government is open, because they have to demonstrate they hate President Trump. Just this week, President Trump announced an historic Middle East peace deal. And yet, virtually zero Democrats could bring themselves even to say his name. Bill Clinton praised President Trump for the Middle East peace deal. Hillary Clinton praised President Trump for the Middle East peace deal. I commend Bill and Hillary Clinton, and I will say in my time in the Senate, that is the first time that sentence has ever come out of my mouth. I commend Bill and Hillary Clinton. But why is it, indeed, Senator Booker put out a statement about the Middle East peace deal, that nowhere in it was President Trump's name to be found? I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, there is power in saying his name. Just as the Democrats are terrified of saying the name Donald J. Trump in any way connected to anything positive, so too are the Cuban communists terrified of saying the name Oswaldo Paya. I am hopeful that my friend, the senator from New Jersey, will put aside the partisan rancor that characterized the Democrats in this body, and will say, let's come together and stand for the Cuban people. Let's stand for Cuban Americans in this country. Let's stand for freedom. Let's stand for democracy. Let's stand for human rights. That ought to be bipartisan. Time will tell whether it continues to be in the United States Senate. I yield the floor.